expansion of indigo cultivation in India. Now, as we saw that there was a need for the Britishers to expand the cultivation of indigo in India because they had a very strong demand of indigo by cloth makers. Now, there was a sudden expansion in cultivation of indigo in India. So, the company faced difficulties in procuring indigo from different parts of the world, as earlier there were few countries which were contributing, which were exporting indigo to Britain. But now that part faced a lot of difficulties for transportation. So, it looked for ways, it looked for different kind of countries which could help in expansion of cultivation for procurement of indigo and dyes. So, from the last decades of the 18th century, the later part of the 18th centuries, indigo production, the cultivation of indigo spread and expanded rapidly in the state of Bengal. It came to dominate the world market. So, the indigo cultivators in Bengal, they started to dominate the world market. In 1788, by about 30% of indigo imported into Britain, it was from India. So, Britain, they used to take 30% of the indigo from India. So, by 1810, just few years after that, the proportion increased to 95%. So, imagine how much the trade and how much the demand for Indian indigo increased. So, from 30%, it increased to 95%. With this type of growth in the indigo trade, commercial agents, officials of the company, they invested in indigo production. So, there was a very rapid, there was a very rapid increase in the demand. So, at the same time, the people who were working in the same field, they saw it as an opportunity to earn and get profits. So, they started to invest in the production as well. After this, numerous company officials, they left their job and they invested their time, money and energy into business of indigo. So, these officers, they became businessmen and they started the trade of indigo cultivation. What was the reason behind this? So, due to high profits, a very strong margin, a lot of Scottish men, a lot of Englishmen, they turned into producers and businessmen who were trading in indigo. Those who had no money, they got loans from money lenders and they invested that loaned money into the cultivation of indigo and gained high profits. All these factors, all these things that we have learned till now, they resulted in high demand and increased cultivation of indigo in India. Britain turns to India. As we saw that the Britishers, since there was lack of supply from West Indies and America in terms of transportation and procurement of raw material for making blue dye. So, in this point, Britain turned to India and saw a market that indigo could be produced in India and it could be exported to their European cloth markets. So, there was a sharp collapse. There was a collapse in the indigo plantations of the Caribbean islands. So, usually the Caribbean islands, they used to produce indigo and supply it to Britishers. But what happened? Their system, it collapsed. The plantations, they were destroyed. So, the African slaves, they rose to rebellion in 1791, killing their rich planters. So, there was an Afro-American war. So, at that time, the slaves, they rose to power. There was a strong rebellion and they destroyed all the rich planters. So, in 1792 also, slavery was abolished in French colonies in Africa. There were French colonies which were ruled by France. In 1792, slavery was abolished over there. Under these conditions, the indigo plantations collapsed. Since the slaves, they were not bound to grow indigo now, they were free. In this case, the indigo plantations, they were collapsing, they were destroyed completely. Here you can see an image of a slave revolt in Saint Dominique in August 1791. This painting is by Chilodski in the 18th century. So, here as you can see, it is covered in blue. Why do you think it is marked in blue? It is to mark that indigo plantations and indigo cultivation was one such industry which was suffering in between all these rebellions. So, the African slaves who worked in these plantations, they rose to rebellion. They started revolting against the French people who ruled and who colonized these colonies of Africa. So, there was a protest, slavery was abolished. In that case, huge plantations, huge farms where the indigo was produced and cultivated, they were destroyed. Now, Previously we have discussed that there was a very high demand and importance of indigo. But what was the process of cultivation of indigo? Let's see that. So there are two major systems of indigo cultivation. One is Nij and the other is Ryoti. Okay. So the two systems are Nij and Ryoti. So under Nij system, under this system, the planter produced indigo in lands he directly controlled. So under Nij system, the planters, the cultivators, they used to produce the indigo in the land owned by and controlled by them directly. Okay. So either they bought land. So where did this land of direct control came from? It was either bought land or it was rented from other zamindars. There were two sources of having control over the land where indigo could be cultivated. First, if you have money, if the cultivators they had money, they bought the land. Otherwise, they used to rent it from other zamindars. Apart from that, he used to produce by directly employing or hired laborers in order to produce and cultivate indigo. So there was also help and cultivators available who used to work in these farms, and they were directly appointed by these landowners. Under this Ryoti system, planters forced riots or riots to sign a contract satta. So under Ryoti system, now we have discussed Nij. What happened under Ryot system? There were signed contracts between the cultivators and the person who owned and controlled the land. So these cultivators got a loan against this satta. So it was just like mortgage. Okay. So this contract, it was known as satta, and against this satta they used to get loan. And the riots were dissatisfied with the system and turned violent. So if there was some kind of problem, some kind of dissatisfaction in the riot system, in the Ryotwari system, if they were dissatisfied by the cultivation amount, there was always violence which was resorted to. The planters, they often faced difficulty in expanding the area under Nij cultivation since land was limited and it was very difficult to buy other form of land or rent the land. They always thought that it limited their cultivation. Indigo could be cultivated only on fertile lands, and land is not fertile throughout the year. There were already densely populated. So planters, they needed large part of land in order to grow and cultivate indigo. So what happened? They tried to get land on lease around the indigo factory. So wherever factories were settled, they aimed that they would get a land to cultivate indigo near them, so that even transportation costs could be saved. Now they could do so. Now how could they get and expand that land on lease? So they could do so by getting evicted the peasants from the areas, as there were peasants who had small parts of land which were forming a big land. What did the riots or the large landowners used to do, the large cultivators used to do? They evicted the small cultivators and peasants from these small parts of land, and they captured or they ruled and controlled the large part to grow indigo. Labor was also not easy to mobilize. So people and laborers, they were living in different rural parts. Okay. So it was not easy to bring them near factories so that they could cultivate the land. A large plantation required numerous laborers, numerous resources at the same time. A large cultivation would ensure that there was a requirement of large amount of laborers at the same time as rice was being cultivated, because it was the crop which used to feed people. So under niche cultivation on a large scale, it needed numerous plough as well. Land had to be fertile, so it had to be tilled by large plough. There was lack of such kind of machinery as well. Bullock carts, cattle was used for ploughing, for tilling the soil. A planter with 1000 bighas would need around 2000 ploughs. So just double the amount. Okay. So if there is 1000 bigha of land on which indigo cultivation is going on, you would need 2000 ploughs. Imagine. Now, investing on purchase and maintenance of ploughs was a big problem, because of course they were not quite affordable. It was difficult to invest in such a humongous amount of ploughs as raw material. Supplies of ploughs and bullocks by the peasants were not easy. So the peasants, they used to supply these plough and bullocks, but it was not easy. There were several challenges. Since peasant plows and bullocks, they were busy on their rice fields. They used to use, the peasants, they used to use these things for rice production. They were not readily available, or they were not ready to give out their tools, their things to indigo cultivators. So, and this production, it took place at the same time as rice production. So, it was a challenge to balance out. Apart from that, in the light of above, the planters, what did they do? They were reluctant to expand the area under niche cultivation. Things were not properly available. It was difficult to obtain raw material as well as plows for tilling the land. So, under niche cultivation, it was difficult to expand the cultivation. Only less than 25% of land production was under niche system. So, here we need to note that only less than 25% of land producing indigo was under niche system. The remaining was under the Ryotuari system.